The lunch lines were packed and flowed like the stream of a river that arrived at the bottleneck of a beaver dam. It nearly came to a stop at the lunch service ladies, who sat behind steamed glass windows and flopped around artificial and hormone-enhanced freezer foods. When I arrived at the teller window, the fatigue and quickly aging lunch lady, who was bound up in an alien-like hairnet, stared at me as a means of asking what I was having to eat that day. I just shook my head no. Not having anything again? Dylan asked as he pushed his tray down the steel grids towards the exit. No, I said. Not hungry. We fell back to a lunch table, sat down, and conversed lightly, as Dylan was partly too concerned with his food to respond to anything I would ask. I couldn't blame him. I would have done the same, had I the appetite. It had been a long day for me. On top of getting lost with Grover, shutting out Miss Kendleton, and having a grand triumph over Mrs. Peterson's test, I hardly could believe I had just hit the halfway marker for the school's day. I was actually feeling tired, and I really wished on the fact that I was back in preschool where nap time was a common occurrence. Then again, when was I ever tired? Only when there were things to be heard. This wasn't a common sign of exhaustion. It was an abstract phone call, if anything, and I wasn't about to pick up. Billy came over. As though in anticipation of replaying the same events that had happened before, I looked down into the seat below me and thought Billy was at it again, looking to start trouble over something as simple as a place to sit. That wasn't the case. Miss Kendleton said you told her that I beat up some kids in the locker room. Billy's voice was lazily projected, but his deep pitch carried his words easily. His arms were slack at his sides, and I didn't sense any form of upset in his mind. He was strangely blank. I didn't know what to say. I did confess such a thing to the counselor, but never thought Miss Kendleton would go out of her way to tell Billy. What kind of treason was this? I managed to pry into Billy's thoughts. My heavy intention to find the answer was fueling my drive. If only I found something, perhaps I could better argue myself out of this mess. I found exactly what I was looking for, the time and place where it all had unfolded. I saw Miss Kendleton urgently approaching him in the hallway. Billy didn't like her. He didn't like much people, but especially her. She wanted to know too many things, and was simply too nosy of a person to win the likes of Billy. I found myself agreeing with all of this. When she arrived next to Billy, she asked him a question. The question was my exact and hesitantly executed words. She told what I had said to the nervous 8th grader who held a malicious thought under his tongue and curled the right side of his lips in anger at my tattling-tailing. He pushed past the school counselor, assuming she was only there to condemn him of things since past. Billy, you're not in any trouble. This won't be held against you, I promise. I just need to know what happened, Miss Kendleton pleaded. I saw it all through Billy's eyes. It was unusually strange to see Miss Kendleton in such an informal and emotional state. I didn't know what to think of it. I wasn't sure if what I saw was fabricated from the mind of its onlooker, or a picture-perfect recollection of the event. Either way, it was very foreign to me, and it all seemed to occur earlier in the day. If I could sense it correctly, this was sometime after my meeting, and well, upset over Miss Kendleton. Billy stopped for a moment, sensing the same strangeness I felt in watching this, as Kathy's behavior was well beyond unusual for her. The vision split like a fractured television screen. Portions of reality flickered into place, replacing the retrospective imagery I saw before, and the crashing sound of a dropped tray brought all my sense screaming back to actuality. I was staring at Billy, who stood some feet away from me without any form of impatience. Not a single hint on his face betrayed whatever emotion he held deep inside. He was completely still, empty-minded, and as though he awaited an order. I'm sorry, I said, expecting Billy to be angry over what I told Miss Kendleton, despite him not seeming angry at all. I don't care, he said, lowering his eyes from me. I told her what happened. I leaned in as though to hear him better. His speech was growing quiet. I said I didn't beat him up, Billy mumbled in nearly a whisper, speaking to the floor. I told her the truth. He paused as though recalling the exact words that he had spoken. That I was protecting them from you. When the joyous ring of the bell was heard, the students were liberated from their uncomfortable desks and ran out of the classroom just as their teachers were trying, in a last-minute effort, to assign them the homework for the night. The front doors of lockers were torn open as books and binders were thrown deep within the things of interest. Athletic balls, cell phones, and the such were fetched from their confines and relocated in the embracing hands of their owners. Like unrestrained magnets, students weaved through the ambient crowds, clashing into their desired attractions, and eagerly began bickering over how the rest of their evenings were to be spent. The cliques came out of hiding, throwing on the uniforms in representation to their clubs or athletics, as the more academic-prone students finally had their one-on-one time with the teachers they so valued. Troublemakers and the like specimens were caught and penned as they attempted to make their stealth runs to the line of buses before they were carried away to the detention centers located in the windowless habitats of the office, where no other student had to fear them. As for me, I simply wanted to go home. I threw on my backpack, walked casually through the hallways, bumping shoulders with the careless crowds until I stepped out the doorway into the open air. A line of buses idled as its occupants climbed into its massive hull, and the subtle roar of their engines made for an emphasizing bass to the high-pitched, excited squeals of the boarding students. Somebody pulled hard on my backpack. "Where are you going?" Dylan asked. "Home," I stated, as though it sounded obvious. "We have football, remember?" "Yeah," I answered. I had forgot. I didn't forget. In that moment, I had thought it all over in but a fraction of a living second. I wanted to go home. I didn't want to play the game. The day I first played football, I thought I had lost a friend. Not just any friend, but my best of friends. I had felt a part of me that day, a part I had never felt before, and it wasn't good. I could say that. I really didn't want to see it again, and most of all, the very foundational reason I didn't want to go to football was an inner feeling that would not subside. A terrible reminder that would not fade, and a threat that would demand in the harshest degree that I was to avoid playing by all means, to silence any revelation of who I am. But who was I? I was Derek Kayon, an 11-year-old boy whose best friend had reconsidered his interest in the sport, and was relying on me, a heroic icon to our coach and teacher, to lead him and our team to victory that would carry out our names. Together, we could well establish ourselves in the school and overcome the simple, oppressive matters that every admitted student must face when entering a new school. This matter meant something to Dylan. He lacked the bravery that I had and needed an opportunity to climb. This was the opportunity, and for me to turn away disinterested would truly sever the friendship I had once feared had broken. Simply put, we went off to football practice. The practice involved another word-stumbling speech by Sean, who tried to establish the art of football in the most inartistic way. It was clear the high school football player knew the game well, but trying to share his experience on the field to a middle school flag football team involved a process of translation Sean was entirely incapable of negotiating. Much like his attempt to get his point across on the first day of practice, Sean had realized that the blank stares the middle schoolers were casting at him spoke of nothing short from the mass confusion. He took the wisest approach from there, and had us scrim off against each other for the remainder of the season. Our coach's eyes were on him. I had felt them from the start. I started the game with the prowling hesitation on my mind, as I knew there was something about the game of football I was supposed to avoid, but I did not know what. The images pierced into my mind were not of the game of football, but Sean himself, and knowing his eyes rested on me in expectation to witness my performance, I became uncommitted to the game. I moped through the field, showing little determination to catch the ball, or even to cover my opponent. Dylan began to notice this too, and his performance began to drastically fade. My apparent laziness became so afflicting to others, Sean pulled me to the side of the field, and asked me what was going on. When I had told him I was simply tired from my long day of school, a great sense of disappointment rose in him, and he allowed me to return to the field with his hopes and interests cast into oblivion. So it brought an end to my football career. Sure, I could no longer play the role of a hero and drive a team to victory, but it really wasn't a big deal to me. I knew I had to do this, for the consequence of disobeying was something I did not want to have to endure, and the lingering warning remained in such potency that my heroic banter, only a few minutes ago, to drive my sports team to victory, simply had been forgotten. Without having any real interest in the game, I spent most of my time observing. As I lazily roamed around the field, avoiding any involvement in the game, I watched Dylan, who too often would look back at me and drop his attempt to catch or receive a ball simply because I lacked the interest. Just play the game. It was dragging me down. The vigor Dylan had shown before, the sudden interest in the game before we marched onto the field, It was all vanishing. It was because of me. I did not want Dylan to suffer because of what I was doing, but why couldn't he just enjoy the game without my encouragement? I incited what I could, and as I sat back and watched Dylan negotiate the game, I was able to transfer what little I knew of the game to him. In moments, Dylan's enthusiasm had jumped. As with every thought I held, with every motivational slogan implanted into his mind, Dylan seemed to respond to it with exciting agility. I felt like I was a beacon, an antenna transmitting orders to a pre-programmed machine that recognized my commands, and every once in a moment, he turned to me, looked into my eyes as though he knew exactly where it was coming from. I could completely remove his fear. Soon the size of his opponents were no longer a considering factor, and although Dylan lacked the physical athleticism as I, his ability to play the game had drastically improved, and his opinion of the game changed for the better. Dylan was not a star player, and despite my attempt, Sean's interest was not perked by Dylan's performance. But the day's practice would be something my friend would not only remember, but something he'd eagerly share with his mother upon returning home. As for me, though my performance was nothing short of abysmal, I slowly began to learn what it was I was capable of. This was not a common thing that I had. It was powerful, and I was warned to keep it in secrecy, to shelter it from others. The reason for that was something I had to know. "Derek, what happened, bro?" Sean asked at the conclusion of practice. "Like you're totally not digging the game anymore." I didn't know what to say. I just shrugged and thought about giving the same excuse I had given before. It was painful to throw away the pride that Sean once held for me, the admiration and belief that I would become a star-playing athlete, somebody who could follow through my evolution in time and even draft into the high school team once I made it to that level. He could sense it. He knew that it was still there, that my ability to play remained, and he was shocked that I would throw it off to something as simple as being lazy from the day's demands. His hopes were drawn by the idea that in the coming days my determination to play the game would return, and he assumed that I simply was having a bad day. I tossed his attention for me off to Dylan. "You did good today, bro," Sean nudged Dylan, giving him the encouragement he needed. Then a sickening thought arose. I'd felt it many times in the past, and hated every moment of its present. There were even times when I had sensed trace amounts of it rising in Dylan's active mind, and a stale taste grew in my mouth. Why did it have to return? Sean looked up over my shoulder with a great interest over someone who approached me from behind, and the emotion that I had grown to hate was blaring out of Sean like an amplified siren. "Derek, you ready to go?" asked Kristen, as her hands came clapping down on the back of my shoulders. My sister had come to pick Dylan and I up from practice, and a giant smile grew on Sean's face at the sight of her. "Hey there," Sean said, with a charming tune, and Kristen returned an equally interested look. I looked up, recognizing it was my sister overhead, and pressed a palm to my head as her eyes were locked onto my coach. Without a moment's pause, I grabbed my sister's hand from my shoulder and ran past her, dragging her back to the car.